While there had been activist movements before then, including abolition and suffrage, the 50s and 60s were a time of a lot of activism and movements that have inspired others and continue on today. This video addresses 4 of those broader movements, including the civil rights movement, Chicanx rights movements, second wave feminism, and Asian American activism, and the changes those movements made. But first, I want to address one thing that all of those movements both benefited from and suffered because of: television. The early days of television were very different from what television is today. Television was live for years because that was the only way of broadcasting at that point. So if you wanted to watch something, you had to sit down and watch it when it was on. Also, there was not much being broadcast at that point, so a larger number of people were watching one thing at the same time. This had a big impact on audiences because a given television program would reach a large population at any given time. This is part of why the Army McCarthy hearings had such an impact on the US. There was not much being broadcast at that time of day, and the people were interested in seeing how the government worked. So the anti-homosexual attitudes it promoted spread across the country, causing many people of a range of ages to climb deeper into the closets that they had constructed for themselves to hide in. It set the stage for future portrayals of homosexuality on television. While film had the Hays Code, television had the code of practices that all programs followed. In addition to banning curse words, not treating divorce lightly, and deeming sex crimes and abnormalities as generally unacceptable, it stated that, quote, illicit sexual relations are not treated as commendable, end quote. In other words, you could not portray homosexuality in a way that could be seen positive in any way. This led to the establishment of a number of tropes we still see in film and television today. People committing suicide because they were homosexual, homosexuals being the villain, and homosexuals being mentally ill all have their roots in those first few decades of television, in both fiction and non-fiction programs alike. The code was amended and adjusted over the years, but it was fully eliminated in 1983, being succeeded by standards and practices at each network. Another impact that television had on US culture was reinforcing hegemonic ideals and norms regarding gender. Sitcoms featured families with a father who had a good career, usually something that included wearing a suit, a mother who stayed home and took care of the kids in the house, and usually at least 2 kids who were mischievous but within gender roles. These shows reinforced what men and women should be doing with their lives and how they should look while doing so, according to mainstream thought, that is. Also, there was not a lot of diversity present at the time either. Even talk shows and variety shows would be careful about having black guests on the show. Networks knew that while they were located in cities like New York and LA, where there was not segregation and it was less anti-black, their programs were being broadcast to parts of the country that was under Jim Crow segregation. For example, Betty White had a show in the 50s and featured a black dancer named Arthur Duncan whenever she could, despite stations in the South saying they wouldn't broadcast her show if he was on it. Being black wasn't treated like being gay or lesbian, but it wasn't included as much as it could have been. Despite having very narrow representation in those early years, television became a tool for marginalized groups to bring attention to the problems they were facing on a daily basis. During World War II, the Second Great Migration occurred, with over 5 million blacks and African Americans moving to the Northeast, Midwest, and West, which was a new destination for these internal migrants. They were seeking jobs that paid well and were high-skilled instead of the low-paying, low-skill jobs they could get in the South. Also, as discussed last week, black men and women were able to serve in the armed forces during the war. In addition to experiencing less discrimination and racism throughout Europe after the war, the GI Bill had been passed in 1944 with the intention of rewarding veterans for their service during the war. Benefits included low-cost mortgages, low-interest loans to be able to start a farm or a business, which one of my grandfathers did, 1 year of unemployment pay, and covering tuition and living expenses to attend high school, college, or vocational school. As long as they had been on active duty during the war for a minimum of 90 days, and they had not been dishonorably discharged, they were eligible to receive benefits. Of course, that wasn't the case for everyone. While distribution of these benefits from the GI Bill were not based on race, the rest of the U.S. still had a lot of racism throughout its institutions and people. Many colleges and universities refused to admit African American applicants, even when they were veterans. HBCUs were overwhelmed with the increase in applications because of the discrimination at other institutions and had to turn away thousands of veterans. Banks and mortgage agencies were especially discriminatory, refusing to give loans to blacks. After experiencing little to no racism by whites in Europe, sometimes even being lauded as heroes for their actions and being discriminated against despite their service, blacks and other minority groups started to fight back in greater numbers and fight for equal rights under the law. Of all the race-based activist movements that have happened here in the US, the one you probably know the most about is the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. The focus of the civil rights movement tends to be the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Often the civil rights movement is thought of as something that began in the 1950s. It is so much more than those two men and that time. By the time Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and others came to be thought of as the faces of the movement by white society, they were simply the latest in a long line of leaders. Even before slavery was abolished, there was work to grant equal rights to everyone, no matter their race or ethnicity. Equal rights was a goal during Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War and emancipation. But it was a struggle to make any progress thanks to the entrenched racism against blacks across the country, both North and South. Some of those early civil rights leaders include W.E.B. Du Bois. He was one of the most well-known leaders of what we call the civil rights movement. He was a founding member of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was a big part of the civil rights movement and is part of Black life today. Du Bois was a prominent intellectual who spoke out against integration into white culture, arguing that blacks should instead embrace their African heritage and roots while living in the white-dominant U.S. He supported the Pan-African movement, which worked to connect the African diaspora with those still living on the African continent. Marcus Garvey also supported the Pan-Africa movement, but he also strongly supported the Back to Africa movement in the early 1900s. Unlike many of his fellow activists, Garvey advocated for black migration back to African nations, leaving the U.S. and its institutional racism behind. Garvey believed that blacks should live separately from whites, even supporting racist beliefs against whites, including anti-Semitic views. Medgar Evers joined the civil rights movement after he was prevented from voting at gunpoint after coming back from surviving the D-Day invasion in Europe. He became a part of the NAACP and got involved in some very high-profile cases of racism, including the lynching of Emmett Till. Evers was shot in the back in his driveway in 1963 and killed. These men all predated Dr. King's and Malcolm X's rise to prominence in the movement and are some of the shoulders upon which those two men stood. One person who was important to the movement and worked with Dr. King is only recently really being talked about, mostly because of who he was. Bayard Rustin was an organizer and an influential person behind the scenes in the movement. He intentionally worked behind the scenes because he was open about his identity as a gay man. Rustin was a member of the U.S. Communist Party in the late 30s, partially because of its support for civil rights for blacks. He left the party after it changed its anti-war stance when Nazi Germany invaded the USSR, as he was an anti-war pacifist. He remained a socialist and a pacifist throughout his life. Rustin was part of the creation of the Congress for Racial Equality, or CORE, another group working for civil rights. He introduced Gandhi's nonviolent approach to protest to Dr. King and helped him with the Montgomery bus boycott, organizing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and the March on Washington. Rustin is a big part of why so much of the civil rights movement happened during the 50s and 60s. I highly recommend watching the film that is about this period of time in his life. Another aspect of the movement that doesn't get talked about often is that it wasn't just men in the movement, including in leadership positions. Women were not simply there to support men in their efforts. Women were leaders within the organization and were treated as equals. Black women especially were seen by their male peers as equals in the work they put in, especially as wives and mothers was often seen as important work, just as important as the jobs their husbands were working. Within the movement, the female voice was recognized as something just as important as the male, and it brought a new perspective to the fight for equality that was needed to ensure that the fight was bringing equality for everyone. Mary White Ovington was both a suffragette and a civil rights leader in the early 1900s. She is another founding member of the NAACP and later served as chair of the organization. She wrote multiple books about Black culture. She died in 1951, before she could see the leaps in progress that were just about to start happening. Rosa Parks was more than a woman who sat on a bus and refused to give up her seat. She was very high up in the movement and had been involved for years before she engaged in her public protest. Despite how it was depicted and taught for decades, Parks's action on that bus was deliberate. Before Parks sat down on that bus and refused to move, a young 15-year-old girl did the same and was arrested for her actions as well. The movement didn't publicize or uphold her actions because she was pregnant and unmarried at the time. 9 months later, Parks engaged in her act of civil disobedience. This act cost her and her husband their jobs. They ended up moving to Detroit, Michigan, where she continued to fight for civil rights. But by the mid-60s, she worked more closely with Malcolm X, as well as the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party. These are just 2 examples of the many women who worked for the equality of everyone, no matter their race or gender. Often, the civil rights movement is referred to as one movement with one person in charge. Often, that person is thought of as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That is far from the truth, as I have already indicated. There were many groups working toward the same goal, working together when they could, which was not as often as you might think. As you read in March Book 1, Dr. King and his nonviolent work inspired others to form their own groups and organizations to do more nonviolent work. Representative John Lewis was one of those people inspired to do nonviolent work. He became involved with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, pronounced SNCC, while in college. Lewis went on to become chairman of the committee, working with other leaders to plan the March on Washington, and he had the honor of speaking at the march right before Dr. King gave his now historic I Have a Dream speech. Mr. Lewis was also the youngest person to speak at the march. SNCC and Dr. King's work are only 2 examples of groups fighting for equal rights for all races under the law. But they did work together when they could. Another group also working to bring dignity and a sense of purpose to African Americans was the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam was founded in 1930 and is based in Islamic tradition and terminology and is a unique form of Islam. To put it another way, scholars have been calling the Nation a cult as far back as 1938. Either way, Malcolm X is probably the most well-known member of the Nation. He joined the Nation while in prison between 1946 and 1952 and became a spokesman for the Nation until he left in 1964. One thing the Nation advocated for was the separation of blacks and whites, saying that black people could survive and thrive on their own without the interference of whites and white culture. Malcolm X preached this separatism vocally throughout his time with the Nation. He disagreed with the lack of response to violence against blacks in the U.S. by the Nation and other aspects of the organization. After leaving, he became more vocal about blacks using their power in the voting booth to make change and Pan-Africanism, seeking to connect African Americans with their distant relatives in the nations of Africa. He even converted to Sunni Islam, further distancing himself from the Nation. He talked in countries around the world, including Egypt, France, and the UK, speaking against discrimination against Africans. He was assassinated in 1965, and it is still not clear who killed him and what their motivations for doing so were. One thing that helped and was used by the movement was television. While it was not uncommon for lynchings to be documented through photos and newspaper articles, most violence against blacks was not covered by the media, especially in film. Television changed that. Attacks against protesters and blacks in general were covered by news programs, showing the nation and sometimes the world some of the violence black people were receiving on a daily basis. For some, this simply reinforced their anti-black racist ideas. For others, it made them aware of the violence and helped them realize that what was reported was not an exaggeration and was often understated. Television not only spread news of what the movement was doing, but brought more people into the movement. One other and very important aspect of the civil rights movement that also tends to get neglected is the diversity of allies to the movement. Your reading Dream Songs, the Music of the March on Washington talks about the various performers who were at the March on Washington, including 3 white performers, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, and Peter, Paul, and Mary. As you read, most of the performers present were black and had more prominent roles in the events of the day. But having these white allies present drew even more attention from white culture to the movement and their goals. As you saw in March, students of all races were part of SNCC, embracing allies who were willing to put themselves on the line alongside their black friends. SNCC wasn't the only organization that welcomed allies of other ethnicities and races, but it was one of the more prominent ones. Archbishop Iakovos of the Greek Orthodox Church of North and South America is another very visible white ally, among other religious leaders and church members of other races. Some, like Iakovos, understood the pain of discrimination firsthand. Others simply saw racism as something that no one should experience, especially in the US. These allies worked with the Black community to support them in a long list of ways, including using their privilege to draw attention to the movement and the racism prevalent throughout the country. There were allies in other parts of life, including the government at all levels and on television and in film. Blacks were not alone in advocating for equal rights, but they were the ones leading the fight. And this is still true of allies today. Let the people you are being an ally to take the lead. Let them dictate what happens and what you do as an ally. They are the ones in charge. Another group that can be misunderstood is the Black Panthers. The Black Panther Party is known for its militaristic stance on Black activism and Black power. But the Black Panthers were so much more than that. The Black Panthers differed from other prominent groups because they were founded in Oakland, California, while most civil rights groups were founded and worked in the South. Also, the Black Panthers were founded in 1966, picking up the torch that was seen to have been put down by much of the movement after the Civil Rights Act became law in 1965. The Black Panthers were about uplifting and supporting the entire Black community across the country. Over time, they spread and established active chapters in major cities like New York, LA, Seattle, Philly, and Chicago. These are places where Black people lived in neighborhoods that were neglected and sometimes crumbling around them because of the lack of infrastructure support. These were also areas where police violence against Blacks was common. This is why the party was so supportive of self-defense in all forms. But they also worked hard, probably harder, to create programs that supported the community that was being neglected by government at all levels. They created a number of survival programs to help these neighborhoods and the people who lived there. One of the earliest was their free breakfast for children programs, available to children before school, giving them a big, hot breakfast before their day began. For many, it was the most complete meal they would have all day. Other programs include childcare, health clinics, and education. These aspects of the Black Panther Party, and the civil rights movement in general, tend to be forgotten, despite being very important to the populations they serve. While the movement is often thought of as ending in the 60s, especially after the assassinations of Dr. King and Malcolm X, but as the Black Panthers show, this is not the case. It is still going on today and likely will not end until there really is equality, possibly equity, under the law for all races. As we've discussed before, Latina people have a unique experience here in the US as a group. They have the experience of both being removed from the lands and being immigrants, coming here intentionally to seek a new life. Most ethnic groups have one experience or the other, not both. In some ways, they can relate to what both Indigenous people and African Americans have gone through as the US was formed and expanded. They were living where they had always lived until one morning they woke up and found themselves living in the US. They were treated only a little better than enslaved and many free Blacks at that point, as well as finding themselves a people forced to be a part of a country they hadn't asked to be a part of. They were told their lands now belonged to someone else instead of being theirs, and that's just the people who were already living here. More often, the narrative is about the immigrants who come here for work and a better life than the one they left behind. Either way, today they experience racial profiling by the police, who remain suspicious of them even when they prove they are citizens of the US and have families and have been here legally for generations. These experiences influence the ways activism happens in the Latina community. But using the term Latina to describe this population is relatively new, as we talked about at the beginning of the semester. While this population defined themselves as Latin Americans going back to at least the 1920s, the activist movement under which many different issues were fought for was called the Chicano movement. Latinas were organizing and fighting for equality as far back as the early 20th century. One organization, the League of United Latin American Citizens, was founded in 1929 and is still active today. Like other civil rights movements, the Chicano movement gained momentum post-World War II. Some struggles gained more national attention than others. One lesser-known struggle that the movement advocated for was the end of compulsory sterilization of Latinas, which started back during the 1910s. It had continued into the 70s, partially because so many women being sterilized didn't understand the doctors because the doctors spoke English and the women didn't, or they had very limited English skills. The movement fought against discriminatory legislation, supported youth and students who fought for equality in their schools and education, and against police brutality. Sound familiar? One of the more prominent causes taken up by the Chicano movement was that of farm workers. Farm workers of all ethnicities had been trying to organize to fight for better pay and working conditions since the early 1900s, but were rarely successful. While the National Labor Relations Act took effect in 1936, saying Americans had the right to unionize for collective bargaining, agricultural workers were exempt, continuing to make it hard for farm workers to organize. In the 1950s, migrant workers of different nationalities, including Mexican and Filipino, were starting to organize successfully. Despite putting in a long day of hard labor out in the fields, the farm workers and their families were living in poverty, when the point was to make money and have better lives. In 1962, activist Dolores Huerta worked with Chicano activists, including Cesar Chavez, to create a new union known as the United Farm Workers. This brought together the Filipino organization, Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, and the Mexican organization, the National Farm Workers Association. The UFW led a strike against grape growers in California, began in 1966 by Filipino workers and supported by Mexican workers that lasted almost 5 years, and ended with an agreement that improved the lives of over 10,000 workers and saw the UFW become a union. During that time, there was a strike in Texas as well. The UFW still exists today and works for the fair treatment and pay of farm workers across the nation, who are still predominantly Latine and other marginalized ethnic groups. While farm workers in the West and South were organizing, another Latine organization was forming in Chicago and other major cities separate from the Chicano movement: the Young Lords. The Young Lords started out as a gang in Chicago, but in 1968 they were reorganized into a political and civil rights movement that grew beyond Chicago to have chapters in almost 30 cities, including multiple chapters in New York. New York City was, and still is, where many Puerto Ricans first moved to when coming to the continental U.S. While the Young Lords started out with Puerto Ricans and Puerto Rican independence, it quickly expanded to support Latine nations and oppressed nations globally. The Young Lords were inspired by the Black Panthers and did many of the same things that the Black Panthers did, just for Latine populations. The two groups also worked together when they had common goals. But, like the Black Panthers and other activist groups in the 70s, the FBI's investigations and interference helped end the organization and the programs they supported. You read about another aspect of the Chicano movement for this week that is still going today: Aztlán. Aztlán has its roots in the Nahuatl legend as a possible paradise that existed somewhere in Mexico before its border was redefined by the U.S. The concept of Aztlán as a connection to Chicanx heritage, culture, and history was first put forth at a National Chicano Youth Liberation Conference. As you read, Chicanx people today still use Aztlán as a unifying ideal and see it more as a cultural thing than a geographical one. Either way, it is something that unifies Chicanx people in the face of pressure to assimilate and turn away from that history and culture. After World War II, women, both those who served and those who remained here at home, went from having jobs that were traditionally masculine and were successful in, to being told to go back to their homes and families. They, along with other groups, had spent most of the war in positions that gave them experiences much closer to equality, only to have it all taken away. This is where the feminine mystique, the problem that has no name, and second-wave feminism came from. Women being tired of being told, you can't do that because you're a woman. They had just spent years showing that they could, while being women, sometimes while being feminine women. They were told how to be better wives and mothers and given medications to keep them happy in the roles by men. Yeah, it wasn't uncommon for housewives to be on medications to combat depression and boredom. Not all women saw anything wrong with being a wife and mother, just like today. But there were, and are, many women who want to have careers, a life outside of the home, don't want to be mothers, and don't want to be wives. Those women began to organize and call out these inequalities while being women who had careers, were single, had children, and or were tired of dealing with sexism that was at every level of U.S. culture. One big part of second-wave feminism was advocating for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. The ERA was introduced in Congress 3 years after white women were granted the right to vote, in 1923. It did not pass through Congress until March 22, 1972. The ERA was passed by Congress thanks in part to the progress made during the 50s and 60s to bring racial equality closer to reality. The Civil Rights Act included the right for everyone to vote no matter the color of their skin, making the 19th Amendment applicable to every woman, not simply white women. Second-wave feminists pushed for the passage of the ERA in Congress and further support for its ratification to continue to expand women's rights. There are other federal laws in place that are supposed to provide a workplace where there is gender equality in all ways. But this still isn't a reality. That's why there was so much support for the ERA. It would make gender equality a part of the Constitution, something that still hasn't been done. You read the entirety of the ERA this week. Yes, that's all of it. It's simple and straightforward. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of sex. Honestly, the two other sections are standard legalese for this type of legislation. Most of the conversation around the amendment is around equality for women and females, which is the important part because of the historic oppression of that half of the population. But there are ways that the amendment will benefit men and males without further privileging them. The ERA does not specify which sex, just that sex cannot be used to discriminate. This means that not only are women not relegated to specific roles or pay grades, but it also means paternity leave on the same level as maternity leave, for example. It also protects people who don't identify as male or female, as more genders are being realized and named in recent years. As we've seen with Black people, legislating equality doesn't mean the country will change overnight, and that sexism and genderism will disappear. But it will make it harder for institutions to discriminate, and that is a big step toward changing the hegemonic thought of society. Yet, despite the simplicity of this language, opposition was vocal, saying inaccurately that the ERA would lead to women being drafted into the armed forces, there would be free abortion on demand, and there would be gender-neutral bathrooms. Sound familiar? The opposition had one thing on their side. When the amendment passed through Congress, a deadline for its ratification was added, something that had never happened to a constitutional amendment before, or since. The opposition only needed to keep a total of 38 states from ratifying it before the deadline. It worked. By June 30th, 1982, 35 of the 38 states had ratified the amendment. Ohio ratified it February 7th, 1974. Since the deadline, 3 more states have ratified it, reaching the 38 states required, even if it is after the deadline. Today, there is an effort to have the deadline repealed and have the ERA ratified and become the newest amendment to the Constitution. The most recent bill to do that passed through the House in 2021, but it was ignored by the Senate and failed. The efforts continue in the hopes that it will get through Congress, hopefully passing and making the ERA law. Another big win for second-wave feminists was the Supreme Court's decision in the Roe v. Wade case on abortion, leading to abortion being federally legalized and guaranteeing other reproductive rights to people with a uterus. Before this, people were able to get a legal abortion under very specific circumstances, but there were more people who needed an abortion than could legally obtain one. So they went to people, sometimes doctors, who would perform an abortion illegally, risking injuries that ranged from infertility to death. That is how important access to abortion care was for some of these people. Abortion rights were important to second-wave feminists because it gave women more control over their bodies and their health. Abortion being illegal does not prevent it from happening. It prevents abortions from being performed by trained medical professionals in safe environments with safeguards for the person receiving the abortion. While second-wave feminism had many successes and helped get U.S. culture and society closer to equality between men and women, it was far from perfect. One of the problems with second-wave feminism was that some of the leaders excluded lesbians from the movement. Lesbians have often faced discrimination that differs from gays, which is part of why they worked separately from gays during the homophile movement. Even though they are female and experience discrimination based on that just as much as straight women, the Lavender Menace, as Friedan put it in 1969, was seen as a threat to the women's movement. Others felt that including queer concerns would make them weaker in the face of the straight white male hegemony. So, many lesbians continued their fight and movement separate from feminism because of this discrimination and exclusion. But more on that movement next week. Another problem was the exclusion of women of color from much of the movement and its leadership. Like lesbians, despite being women and experiencing sexism like white women did, the discrimination they experienced as women of color was rarely addressed. The intersection of racism and sexism was more than the women's movement felt they could address at the time. They felt that by addressing problems faced by women in general, they would make gains for all women. They were partially right, but it left a lot of Indigenous, Black, Asian, and Latina women struggling with the added discrimination based on their race and ethnicity. Over the course of this semester, we have covered a lot of the problems that Chinese and Japanese immigrants faced here in the US. After the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 became law, immigration from across Asia opened up, increasing the diversity of immigrants from that part of the world. Not that there weren't more than just Chinese and Japanese immigrants in the US at that time, but they were by far the dominant ethnic groups from Eastern Asia. After the act opened the doors to the world, including across Asia, immigrants who were highly educated and highly skilled began coming to the US, creating a few new ways of thinking about the population. Because so many of these immigrants were coming and immediately getting employment in white-collar positions that required advanced education and training, the term model minority began to be applied to Asian Americans. At first, the term just applied to Japanese Americans, partially due to their ability to succeed in business, especially in farming, soon after arriving in the US. As more skilled and educated people immigrated to the US from China, Japan, Korea, and India, the more prominent examples, the term began to be applied more broadly. Some scholars theorize that the model minority was created in relation to African Americans, especially during the Civil Rights Movement. As we know, blacks were constantly being told what to do in order to assimilate into white culture and be better. The model minority gave white culture a group to point to and go, see, they're doing things right and are successful. Why can't you do that? Of course, they were ignoring the numerous roadblocks put in black people's way, keeping them from finding that success, including the generations of oppression blacks had endured that new immigrants did not experience. While it sounds like a good thing to be a model minority, it's not. It's still a racist stereotype that is harmful to Asian Americans. The term refers to finding success in education, achieving high standardized test scores, and GPAs in school, and having advanced degrees. It refers to a supposed strong work ethic leading to success that was characterized as genetic. It reduces a complex group of people to a set of statistics used to shame other groups for not trying harder to be like the model minority. While being characterized as a minority group that blacks should work harder to be like, many Asian Americans, like Yuri Kochiyama, were allies during the Civil Rights Movement. Japanese Americans understood oppression thanks to having been detained in internment camps during World War II. The U.S. involvement in both Korea and Vietnam also gave many Asians motivation to ally themselves with blacks, supporting the movement where they could, because they knew that while the movement was led by African Americans, they were fighting for racial equality, not black equality. Also, as I have pointed out previously, Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino Americans had been fighting for equality alongside Hawaiians and Latines for better pay and treatment while working fields. Advocating and engaging in activism was not a new concept for Asian Americans. But the thing is, they weren't Asian Americans. They were Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Filipino Americans, and so on. The term Asian American was coined by UC Berkeley students Yuji Ichioka and Emma Gee in May 1968. They wanted to create a pan-Asian identity that students could unite under and join the Asian American Political Alliance. It was an empowering term because it was something they had chosen for themselves, giving them the ability to reject the term Oriental that was given to them by the mainstream. Because of this, today the term Oriental is used to refer to items, like rugs, not people. Giving people a term to unite under created solidarity between ethnic groups from the continent of Asia, giving them power and numbers to be heard and have an impact on the world around them. By the late 60s, Asian Americans began their own activist movements. They participated in the Third World Liberation Front strikes in 1968. The strike included various ethnic student groups at college campuses across California and drew attention to the need for a broader perspective in higher education. One of the results of the strikes was the establishment of ethnic studies programs and majors across the state, because existing disciplines that studied culture were fundamentally Eurocentric. Across the country, there are now ethnic studies departments that cover African American, Asian American, Raza, Chicano, Latine, Indigenous and Native American, Jewish, and Arab studies. Asian Americans also were part of and allied themselves with the Black Panther Party. Richard Aoki had joined the Black Panthers early in the group's existence and became the only Asian American to have a leadership position. Aoki left the Black Panthers to join the Asian American Political Alliance, but maintained his ties with the Black Panthers. Asian American activists spoke out against the U.S. involvement in Vietnam and worked to create spaces where Asian culture could be properly represented and shared with others. The creation of ethnic studies and Asian studies in colleges and universities were one aspect. Another was through the arts and theater, eventually expanding into film and television. Their activism and work helped create the Asian American identity and community that exists today.